Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy. I'm your host, Nick, and today we have updates on the case about overturning same-sex marriage. Now, it's not to say that same-sex marriage will be overturned, but we do have some updates from Supreme Court justices and a former justice weighing in on the case. Now, same-sex marriage is near and dear to my heart, and if it's near and dear to yours too, then consider subscribing to Not Suitable for Democracy, where I will be sharing updates and the latest news on this very important issue. And you can subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And now you can even follow along on Instagram and TikTok, and they both use the same handle, so you can follow me at NSFD_pod. How did we get here? Well, I go through in more depth in episode 13 of Not Suitable for Democracy, but just to catch you up, let's do a brief recap. Now, in 2015, the Supreme Court had legalized same-sex marriage, pretty much making it the law of the land. Now, fast forward, Kim Davis, a Rowan County clerk in the state of Kentucky, was denying marriage licenses to David Ermhold and David Moore, just your ordinary same-sex couple. Now, they had eventually sued because it was going against their constitutional right? Because in same-sex marriage, in the case, it was originally legalized because that was rooted in the 14th Amendment, granted equal protections under the law. So because of that, they sued, and they actually won, and they won $50,000 apiece in damages from Kim Davis. Now, because of that, Kim Davis later countersued and filed with the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals flatly rejected her and were like, nope, this has no basis in this, no merit, and we're not going to listen to your claim. Kim Davis was claiming that same-sex marriage was wrong at the time when it was legalized and before that. So just because she feels it's wrong, she was trying to force the law to kind of bend to her will, which isn't necessarily freedom of speech, because remember, even though as a private citizen, we are allowed to exercise the freedom of speech, Kim Davis was at the time, as the Rowan County clerk, acting on behalf of the state. So if you're acting on behalf of the state, you have to follow state law. Even what some of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals judges were saying was that if that was the case, you could just throw out the Bill of Rights willy-nilly whenever you felt like it. So we're not letting that happen, and I'm glad the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals chose not to grant her wish. So because of that, here we are, where Kim Davis is now filing a petition to the Supreme Court. Now, back in September 8th was the deadline for David Ermhold and David Moore to file a response to Kim Davis's petition. Fortunately, although they had waived their original petition and the Supreme Court asked them to file a response, they were granted an extension to October 8th. So, at the time of this recording of this podcast, it is October 13th, 5 days after the deadline when David Ermhold and David Moore had to file their official response to Kim Davis's petition. Now, the Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices, but it wasn't exactly all 9 who forced David Ermhold and David Moore to respond with a petition. In this particular case, what was happening was that there are 3 people that could potentially decide the fate of same-sex marriage. That is a bold claim, but hear me out. Because Kim Davis filed a petition, usually there is something called a cert pool, where one office clerk from one of the Supreme Court justices, and mind you, 7 of the justices participate in this cert pool. So one of the clerks of the 7 justices' offices will now have to not only read Kim Davis's petition, but then also the call for a response. And then based on the responses from both parties, the office clerk will then have to write a memorandum. And that memorandum will then include a recommendation if the Supreme Court justices, all 9 of them, should move forward with a case. If they move forward with the case, this is the case to overturn same-sex marriage. So ideally, we don't want that memorandum to recommend moving forward with the case. Now, however, I noted that there were 7 Supreme Court justices a part of the cert pool, and 2 are not. And those justices are Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Neil Gorsuch. Now, those 2 are not a part of the cert pool, meaning that they would have to review the petitions on their own. So they will have to review what Kim Davis said and what David Armhold and David Moore said in their respective petitions. Now, those are the 3 people that would decide, or at least recommend, if the case should move forward. Now, while they do have that opportunity or power, let's say, it doesn't mean the case will move forward automatically if one of them says yes. For a case to move forward, right, ideally, there would need to be a majority, a minimum majority of votes to overturn same sex marriage. Because that's the whole point of Kim Davis, that's the whole point she's making. So that if they overturn, or if they hear the case, then ideally this would be a mechanism to overturn same sex marriage. Let's think about it, right? You've got one office clerk, Neil Gorsuch, and Samuel Alito. Those are the 3 that will have to decide if a case should be brought forward. And again, to do that, they would need a majority opinion to overturn same sex marriage. Now, in order to do that, right, they don't necessarily know who's going to be the yes votes and the no votes. But we have some ideas on who actually may be interested in overturning same sex marriage and who will not. And that's based on some recent events, based on some quotes and some interviews from 3 of the justices. So first, we have back in September when Justice Amy Coney Barrett was promoting her memoir. And in that book, she was really trying to give a deeper dive on her thoughts about the court, explaining explaining the state of the law, and basically getting an inside look of how she, thinks about her role as a justice and family and all that fun stuff. So through all of that, she was doing an interview with CBS. Now, this was back in early September. And mind you, from CBS, this was before CBS had officially signed the deal with Barry Weiss, who is looking to take over as CBS's editor-in-chief. That's a whole other topic for a whole other day, but just know this happened before Barry Weiss joined CBS. Now, Amy Coney Barrett was making the case in her book basically that certain rights are fundamental and they shouldn't be changed. That included, birth control, that included the right to marry. Now, conversely, there were some other rights that she was trying to explain that are not guaranteed, such as the right to have an abortion. She did not feel that was a right, along with a few other policies that here we are still trying to fight and defend. Now, because of that, the way she had talked about marriage in the book, right, one of the CBS interviewer at the time had pressed her to clarify her point of view. And she kind of gave like a non-response, right, basically saying like, the right to marry is, settled and it's kind of is what it is. But because of that, some legal experts were saying, based on her like non-response, she doesn't have an interest in overturning same-sex marriage. And why should she, right? Although she is a conservative justice, she's also known for being a swing vote. And we know that she's taken some heat by being that swing vote and siding with some of the liberal justices in past cases. Now, this may bode well for marriage equality, especially considering the response from another justice that I'm about to get to in a little bit. So hold that thought. Amy Coney Barrett, she may be on board with keeping marriage equality the law of the land. Now, the second justice under review is Justice Samuel Alito. His comments came under fire on October 3rd. Now, on October 3rd, Samuel Alito was giving a speech at a conference, a conservative conference, mind you, and during the speech, he was lambasting marriage equality. And he's been very critical of the speech, and he is one of the only justices that is still on the Supreme Court from when same-sex marriage was originally legalized. So he didn't like it then, and he doesn't like it now. However, during the end of his, tirade about marriage equality, he did give a disclaimer. And his disclaimer was, although it's not his, preferred ruling, the ruling must be respected. And that comes from basically a very important precedent called stare decisis. And that's a Latin phrase. And stare decisis is basically, legal precedent must legal precedent by the court must be respected, especially if it's based on reliability. So in this case, stare decisis is making sure that marriage equality is the law of the land because so many same-sex couples rely on those laws, that are afforded through marriage equality. And it's not just, the right to get married and wear a ring. It really is more than that. It's about, what ownership of property, transferring estates, even becoming a parent when you're adopting children and parental rights. But also like who has, rights when your partner gets sick or when your spouse gets sick, right? Who is taking care of who? And plus, like, it comes down to the rights that are afforded to, men and women that are married, but now they're also afforded in same sex couples who can obviously be seen as equal under the law. And because, marriage has been nestled within our systems for so many years, it's just become so second nature to so many couples. But now that, navigating, being a spouse and paperwork and all of the, intricacies that come with legalities from these fundamental rights, it is very important that we do not really rock the boat because essentially this could really screw over tons of people, our systems, and how, things are carried out from, the ruling on out. So it sounds like although Samuel Alito does not support same sex marriage, he does support the legal precedent, and I don't think he's inclined to necessarily overturn it. Now, based on stare decisis, this leads me to the third Supreme Court justice, okay? And this gentleman was actually a former justice. Now, this is Kennedy, who was the former justice who wrote the opinion that would legalize same-sex marriage. So this was back in 2015, and Justice Kennedy had essentially, affirmed that through the protection of the 14th Amendment, citing equal rights under the law, that same-sex marriage would be law of the land. There's more to it than that, but that's essentially what it was. So here we are today where, equal rights under the law should be afforded to every American. Now, recently, as of October 8th, right, just 5 days after Samuel Alito made his comments, this is when former Justice Kennedy had then shared that he does not believe that same-sex marriage should be overturned, citing stare decisis, its legal precedent must be respected. But the case he argues is about same-sex families, same-sex parents who have children that are adopted. Now, that being said, right, I just mentioned how it's so important that parental rights are protected, especially when there's same-sex parents involved. Now, when children are involved, that's even more of a legal jungle, safari, what have you, to navigate because, so many laws are contingent upon, children's rights, parental rights, like who is the guardian and like who has legal guardianship over these children. And with that said, we know that if someone is not the biological, offspring of a certain parent, right, which so many same-sex couples do have that in their household, it becomes tricky with the law. But Justice Kennedy, right, he was claiming that because same-sex couples with children would have to, essentially, if they lose those rights, they would, number one, their children would know the harm of not feeling equal. And the children would understand that being unequal under the law would cause serious levels of harm and unfair treatment, not only through the law, but even just through their communities, their peers, and whoever else. In addition, because like I mentioned before, parental rights are so important, especially when dealing with children, that would throw so many same sex couples and families into disarray. It wouldn't be clear as who has, guardianship rights and uh, how folks would navigate like buying a home, sending their children to school, right? Should someone pass away, where does the estate get passed to? Like these are all very serious and important questions that are protected under the law. So without same sex marriage, right, this would throw a lot of that into a scramble. And Justice Kennedy, when he wrote the opinion legalizing same sex marriage, he also was thinking of these same sex couples who had children. And at the time, he believed there were only like 75,000 same sex couples with kids back in 2015. Well, it turns out there were hundreds of thousands of same sex couples with children. And these adopted children, right? This also made it more of an issue because between adoption law and, again, parental rights and guardianship laws, it would just cause such havoc on these families. And Justice Kennedy knows this. If same-sex marriage was overturned, it would cause so many headaches and so much bad blood for every party involved, especially same-sex couples with children. And it's not just a small amount. If there's hundreds of thousands, there's even more hundreds of thousands by 2025 today. So that being said, he strongly believes that the current 9 justices will not overturn same-sex marriage because stare decisis is the legal precedent that will be respected, and 2, if they do overturn same-sex marriage, it would cause so much harm to those families, same-sex couples with children. So, assuming it does not come to that, right, because they will be protected under the law, and there will not be enough support to overturn same-sex marriage. So, it's halfway through October. What does this mean for the same-sex marriage case, and will it get overturned? So, going back to the 3 people who would have to decide to potentially bring the case forward. And they would bring the case forward, right? Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and one of the office clerks from one of the 7 justices' offices. They would have to decide if there will be, if it's recommended that they bring the case forward, and if they do, will they have a majority opinion to overturn same-sex marriage? So, now if we take everything we learned into consideration, right? Just keeping it focused on the topics we talked about, right? Well, we know that the 3 liberal justices, right? Alina Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, and Justice Ketanji Brown, the 3 of them will not vote to overturn same-sex marriage. Well, it's not really a vote, but they will side with keeping same-sex marriage law of the land, which is great. So for those who also don't want to overturn same-sex marriage and keep same-sex marriage law of the land, right? You just need 2 more justices who are going to side with the liberal justices. Now, based on Amy Coney Barrett's interview with CBS, there is a chance that she may not want to overturn same-sex marriage. So she may be the 4th vote, meaning that all of the 4 women justices would look to keep same-sex marriage law of the land. Now, after hearing Samuel Alito's, or Justice Alito's reasoning, as much as he did not support same-sex marriage in the past, and as much as he does not support it now, he does support the legal precedent, stare decisis. So because of that, he also may choose to keep same-sex marriage law of the land. So he could be a 5th vote. Possibly unlikely, right? Because he's conservative and we know how it's never really predictable, right? They usually, vote along party lines, but you never know. So he is a possible 5th vote that would keep same-sex marriage law of the land. Now, between the other justices, right? Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Clarence Thomas, we know that those 3 definitely want to overturn it. There's no reason for them not to, right? So Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, they're Trump appointees, right? So they're going to pretty much do what he says or what he wants. And you know that Trump wants to overturn same-sex marriage because that's what his base wants. So by default, those two will definitely vote to overturn same-sex marriage. Clarence Thomas, he's a lost cause, right? He's been funded by so many billionaires and billionaire donations that he did not disclose on his ethics form, which, if you recall, AOC even was calling on him to step down and resign because you can't be accepting money from billionaires and then vote on cases that favor those billionaires. And that's our Supreme Court. So, last but not least, Justice John Roberts, he is the Chief Justice, and he would also need to choose to decide if he is going to look to overturn same-sex marriage or keep it law of the land. So, if we were to take Samuel Alito's words, think about what he said about keeping legal precedent, and John Roberts, who does seem more reasonable and who has sided with the liberal justices on rare occasion, one or the other could could side with the liberal justices to keep same-sex marriage law of the land. Now, I know basically none of the men on the court do support same-sex marriage, but the two of them, John Roberts and Samuel Alito, do respect legal precedent. So will that be enough to keep same-sex marriage law of the land? What do you think? Now, please let me know in the comments, right? Let me know here on YouTube. You can let me know if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Then follow me on Instagram or on TikTok and send me a comment there. And you can follow me at NSFD_pod. So with all of that, right, we definitely have some time to figure out what's going to be happening, right? Based on this assessment, it seems like they will not look to overturn same-sex marriage based on Kim Davis's petition that was filed. Now remember, her legal grounds was pretty shaky because all she said was that same-sex marriage was not constitutional when it was legalized and before that, which isn't really much of a case. Legal experts say it's not enough to overturn same-sex marriage. And in addition, we also know that, again, there would have to be 5 justices looking to overturn it, but it looks like there are at least 5 justices looking to keep legal precedent and keep same-sex marriage law of the land. And lastly, what would the ramifications be not only to, same-sex couples, but more importantly, what would this look like for the state of the Supreme Court as an institution itself? We know that so many institutions aren't trusted, and without these strong, pillars that make up, our American government and democracy, it would beg the question, right? Can we trust the Supreme Court? Are they acting impartially? Do they have bias, right? And we know that, yes, the conservatives are going to usually vote conservative and liberals vote in the liberal way, but it's not always guaranteed. And that's what makes most of these cases very fascinating, because sometimes it doesn't always, turn out the way we expect. So will this be one and done case where the 5 who don't want to overturn legal precedent, uphold the rule of law like that and just let it go? Or will Samuel Alito and John Roberts side with the other men and decide to overturn same-sex marriage? Or will Amy Coney Barrett throw a curveball as a swing voter and also choose to overturn same-sex marriage? As of today, we don't officially know. But we do know that because October 8th was the deadline, the justices will be having to review the memorandum and these petition cases very soon. Now, just putting it in the timeline of perspective here, right? If the deadline was October 8th, they're going to have to be reviewing this case in the coming weeks. So we should know by sometime in November, if not December. And then once we do know, right? Let's say there's bad news and they do choose to hear the case. Well, we would hear the case in the spring of 2026, and then we would get a final ruling in June of 2026. So we'll know very quickly if, they were looking to overturn same-sex marriage. So, if they do, right, fast forward come spring, fast forward come June, And remember, they're only going to really say yes to that if they say yes at this point, because they'll have the case in the spring and they're going to vote to overturn it, and we'll know in June. June 2026 is only what, like 5 months, give or take. Maybe a little bit less than 5 months. A little bit less than 5 months when the ruling happens to the 2026 midterm elections in November of that year. So if we start to see, a lot of pushback and disappointment, right? We all know what happened in 2022, shortly after Roe v. Wade was overturned. There was definitely a blue wave that really bolstered or even saved Democratic seats. Because normally in an off-year election like that, the party in power in the White House usually sees a swing in the other direction, right? When Obama came to power in 2008, he was crushed in the midterms by a Republican red wave in 2010. Same with Trump in 2018. When Trump became president in 2016 the first time, we saw a huge blue wave in 2018, ousting a lot of Republicans, also making it one of the most diverse bodies of the House of Representatives in modern history. So now, back in 2022, Biden was president as a Democrat who was elected in 2020. 2022 was supposed to be the year we saw a huge red wave. Well, at that point, the Republicans only picked up a few seats. It was way less than what was anticipated, and there's been a small margin between Republicans and Democrats in the House ever since. So, if they somehow overturn same-sex marriage in June of 2026, right, then by November of that year, we are most likely seeing a huge blue tsunami tidal wave, right? Because if Trump is in the White House now, we know it's going to head toward the Democrats. But to what extent, we don't know. But if they overturn same-sex marriage, the momentum from that, huge disappointment could be enough to bolster Democrats and independents who just support same-sex marriage. That may be enough to oust a ton of Republicans, or more that's currently anticipated or on track to normal trends and precedent. We'll see how this all plays out, right? There's so many factors that could play into a midterm election, but at this point in time, it is safe to say that things are looking hopeful for same-sex marriage, right? And we're going to know the actual fate of same-sex marriage within the coming weeks. So please stay tuned for more updates from Not Suitable for Democracy. As someone who is married right now and does have the right to marry in this country, it will be a huge disappointment, a huge blow to me, my family, people I know who really do take the right to marry seriously. So I would really encourage everyone to, stay tuned for what's to come, stay hopeful, because at this point in time, it's still very unpredictable. And while we keep hearing a lot of, negativity, doom and gloom, right? We just know that based on the legal precedent and even just kind of analyzing this case, there is actually still hope that we may not see same-sex marriage overturned from this instance. However, we know that the conservative movement is looking to overturn same-sex marriage eventually. So if Kim Davis is unsuccessful this time, there may be a case in the near future, not from Kim Davis, but someone else who could try to challenge same-sex marriage and get it overturned in the future. I know you may be nervous about the fate of same-sex marriage, but we still have hope. So please, please, please consider just taking a deep breath, fighting the good fight, and let's keep organizing, because that is how we will truly protect our rights and our fundamental right to marry. So, if you liked what you heard and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy, and you can stay updated on marriage equality and more LGBTQ plus related news by subscribing to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And you can also follow along. Let me know what you thought about this episode. You can let me know in the comments, send me a question. I'll try to do my best to answer. And you could follow me on Instagram and TikTok. They both use the same handle, so you can follow me at NSFD_podcast. pod. Thanks again so much for tuning in to today's episode. And remember, democracy is not suitable without you.